Version 3. One more slash or one less, that is the leitmotif of this version. Remember that phrase. I will repeat it later. What's more, I will show you a photo of the person who uttered it. And you will immediately understand why this murder was never solved. Consequently, it has gone down in history shrouded in mystery, wrapped in myths and a fog of ambiguity, and heavily seasoned with sensational newspaper headlines. Now, let's go back to January 15, 1947, to that very vacant lot where the dismembered body was found. Securing the crime scene. It simply didn't happen. When Detective Harry Hansen arrived, he was furious at what he saw. Local newspaper photographers were scurrying around the victim's body, scouting for the best camera angles. Used flashbulbs, cigarette butts, and matches lay scattered everywhere. The scene had been trampled beyond repair. Moreover, reporters later argued over exactly who had closed the victim's eyes. There is still debate about who arrived first, the journalists or the police. But one thing is clear. The scene was rendered useless for the investigation. It had been destroyed. Nearby, on the road, a vehicle track containing a heel print was discovered. Photographs were taken, but they were subsequently lost. A cement bag that had been lying next to the body also vanished. After the body was delivered to the morgue, detectives instructed the pathologist to test the victim's internal organs, specifically the liver, for alcohol or drugs. Then, in a most peculiar turn of events, the liver disappeared. Morgue staff claimed it had been accidentally discarded. The stomach contents also went missing. Due to this mishap, no one will ever know whether the victim was under the influence of alcohol or narcotics. It was also impossible to determine this via blood analysis, as the killer had drained the body of blood. Moreover, before dumping the body on the vacant lot, he washed it down with gasoline using a dish brush. Then, a series of events unfolded that no one could have foreseen at the time. The killer himself made contact with journalists. On January 23, 1947, an unidentified person called the newspaper office and stated that he would soon send the victim's personal belongings, then quickly hung up. The call could not be traced. The very next day, an envelope arrived in the mail, one that really needs to be seen to be believed. The envelope smelled of gasoline. Inside were the victim's personal items, as well as Mark Hansen's address book, from which several pages had been carefully cut out. From that moment on, Mark Hansen was inextricably linked to the murder of Elizabeth Short. He remained under scrutiny because of the case until his death in 1964. Moving beyond the details to the people involved, let us consider another theory. But for now, let us continue. January 26, 1947. Another letter arrived. Notably, it was signed with a ballpoint pen, a great rarity at the time and possibly one of the first instances of a criminal using one. In the letter, the suspected killer promised to turn himself in. January 30, 1947. A postcard. The sender refused to surrender and offered a brief explanation for Elizabeth Short's murder. He claimed the killing was justified. Let's pause here for a moment. As you can see, you don't need to be an expert to notice the obvious. The killer is consumed by a thirst for fame. From the method used to dispose of the body to the series of letters and the package, his actions scream, "Look, I did this." And the public interest in the murder of Elizabeth Short drives him to the peak of gratification. Let's step back a bit. On January 25, 1947, the police found a handbag and a shoe belonging to Elizabeth Short at a garbage dump. These items had previously been in a trash can, where they were spotted by Robert Hyman, a CAF manager, who then notified the police. An admirable act. The dumpster had been emptied before the police arrived, and although they had to sift through a great deal of trash, their efforts paid off. The second shoe was never found, even though a hotel employee insisted it had been there. Robert Manley positively identified the items. As time passed, the investigation stalled. Those closely monitoring the police work on the Elizabeth Short case increasingly voiced the same suspicion. Someone was obstructing the Black Dahlia investigation. Someone was determined to prevent the police and the public from picking up the killer's trail. Yet there were also those who were doing everything in their power to find the murderer. One such individual was Joseph Paul D. River, a staff psychiatrist for the Los Angeles Police Department, whose duties included identifying people who made false confessions. There were many such individuals in the Elizabeth Short case, people who either showed up at the police station in person or sent letters. Dr. D. River read through and analyzed hundreds of these letters, yet as a rule, they contained nothing of interest, until a certain point. On October 28, 1948, a letter from a certain Jack Sand of Florida landed on the doctor's desk. The author claimed that his friend Jeff might be Elizabeth's killer.
Joseph D. Rita became interested in the letter and began an active correspondence with its author. Developments also took place regarding the Short case within the police department. Under public pressure driven by demands to catch the killer, given that bodies were regularly being found within the City of Angels, the Gangster Squad took up the Black Dahlia case. This was an elite police unit tasked with the toughest assignments, such as combating gangsters or rooting out police corruption. Naturally, the squad operated covertly. Meanwhile, Dr. Joseph D. River continued corresponding with Jack Sand throughout the winter of 1948. With each new letter, he became increasingly convinced that he was likely communicating with the actual killer of Elizabeth Short. Soon, thanks to the joint, covert efforts of Dr. River and the gangster squad, they managed to discover that the name Jack Sand was an alias for 27-year-old Leslie Dwayne Dillon. I will skip a great deal of extraneous information to get to the most interesting details. A search of his home turned up an item that was interesting and, at the time, rare. A ballpoint pen. Remember the killer's letters, written with just such a pen. The handwriting, incidentally, also bore a resemblance, as did the spelling errors found in certain words. Detectives were subsequently surprised to discover that the home of Leslie Dillon's in-laws, where he occasionally stayed, was located right next to the trash bin where Elizabeth Short's shoes and handbag had been found. Dillon himself worked at a funeral home, where his job involved draining blood from corpses. Dr. River managed to persuade Leslie Dillon to meet with him. This is where things get interesting, and this information has been verified multiple times. During their face-to-face meeting, Joseph D. River succeeded in winning Dillon's favor. Moreover, Leslie Dillon referred to the doctor as a friend and made no secret of the fact that he was deeply flattered by the attention of such a prominent figure in Los Angeles. Dillon answered D. River's questions calmly and casually. For instance, he admitted to having a penchant for sexual sadism. He was also aroused by women with large mouths. His answers revealed knowledge about the Short murder that even the detectives investigating the case did not possess. Some of his responses were chilling both to the doctor and to the members of the gangster squad who were eavesdropping through the wall from the adjoining hotel room. It is a great pity that no audio recordings were made of these casual conversations. Want an example of a chilling answer? Here it is. When asked why he thought the killer had dismembered Elizabeth Short's body, Leslie Dillon replied, "By separating the lower body and making an incision in the lower abdomen, one could observe how deeply the penis penetrated. It was generally believed that the killer dismembered the body for ease of transport and that the abdominal incision was an act of sadism serving no practical purpose." Dillon, however, explained something no one else had been able to explain before, though, in answering, he was referring to his supposed friend Jeff. He also described what the killer did with the hair shaved from the victim's pubic area, stuffing it into her rectum, and stated that the killer had inserted a piece of flesh bearing a rose tattoo into her genitals. This was information known to only a few police officers, yet Dillon possessed it as well. When asked where the murder might have taken place, Dillon replied, "Anywhere. For instance, in the cheapest motel in town." He described how the body would be dismembered right there in the bathroom, on the floor, or even on the bed, and how each body part would later be washed in the shower. Dillon also confided in Dr. River that he had lost 18 kilograms over the past 2 years, following a significant event in his life. It is not hard to guess which event he was referring to. It seemed Elizabeth Short's killer had been found and the case closed. But then came a twist. Dillon tossed a note out of his hotel bathroom window stating that he was being held against his will. The note was found, the police were called, and they rescued Leslie Dillon from his captors. He agreed to take a polygraph test, but only in the presence of a lawyer, whom he promptly hired. That lawyer, Morris Lovini, was one of the city's best and most expensive. Where an unemployed former hotel bellop and pimp got the money to pay him remains unknown, though one can certainly guess. However, things took a completely different turn. With his lawyer present, Dylan refused to take the polygraph test or undergo interrogation under the influence of truth serum. Jeff, initially thought to be merely Dylan's imaginary friend, turned out to be a real person. Incidentally, his wife had at one time lived in Mark Hansen's house. At the time of the murder, he, like Dylan, had a questionable alibi. Leslie Dillon's alibi, however, looked more like a fabrication. Yet, proponents of the theory that George Hodel killed Short hold a different view. The gangster squad planned to arrange a confrontation involving Leslie Dillon, Jeff Connors, and Mark Hansen. Sometime later, Dylan hired an even more expensive and effective attorney, Arthur Rose, and filed a lawsuit against the Los Angeles Police Department and demanded a staggering $100,000, an enormous sum for $1,949 for his unlawful abduction and interrogation. However, he later dropped the lawsuit after Dylan was caught stealing valuables from a hotel safe and apparently struck a deal with the police. Once all charges against Dylan were dropped, he boarded a bus and left Los Angeles. There is even a photograph of him with his suitcase. After his interrogation and release, Jeff Connors also left for parts unknown. It was as if someone had warned them that they had better get out of the City of Angels and stay away for a long time before moving on to the next and equally fascinating part of this story. Let me share a legend with you. It is said that those who spend a long time investigating the Black Dahlia case might see Elizabeth Short appear in their dreams and reveal the killer's name. Let's continue. Care for a touch of horror. If you find yourself in Los Angeles, you can actually spend the night in the very building where Elizabeth Short was most likely murdered. The Astor Motel, built in 1946 and opened that December, was the cheapest motel in town at the time, and 80 years later, it remains just as affordable, though it has undergone some minor changes and expansions. It was here, presumably in room 3, that Elizabeth Short was killed. This motel is located not far from the spot where her dismembered body was found. In the summer of 1949, a special gangster squad unit zeroed in on this motel, notably thanks to Leslie Dillon's mother, who mentioned during questioning that her son had occasionally stayed there. The Astor Motel. Detectives also tracked down people who had worked there in January 1947. They got immediate results. A man living near the motel confidently identified Elizabeth Short from a photograph, stating that he had seen her in January 1947, a memory that stuck with him because she had asked him for some change to make a phone call. A motel maid recalled that on January 17, 1947, an unusually large dry cleaning bill arrived. Prior to that, she had been horrified to discover a room where the bed and floor were stained with blood and human feces lay on the bed. The motel owner forbade her from cleaning the room and did the job himself, something he had never done before. When questioned, the, by then former, owner confirmed the maid's account. Furthermore, he mentioned 2 army blankets that were wadded up and heavily soaked with blood. There was also a paper bundle, in which the motel owner discovered a woman's blouse and a black skirt, items that, as it later turned out, matched the description of the clothing Elizabeth Short was wearing when last seen, as well as a pair of men's shorts heavily stained with blood in the crotch area. The motel owner burned all these items in the incinerator. When police asked why he had not contacted them, Hoffman, the former owner, simply replied that he was an ex-convict and did not want any unnecessary dealings with the police. Specialists dispatched to the scene immediately discovered traces of dried blood behind the baseboard in room 3. They collected samples, but as you might have guessed, they vanished. The motel underwent major renovations in the 1980s, so looking for new evidence or leads now is pointless. All that remains from that terrible night are the walls, and walls, as we know, cannot speak. When the former owner's wife was questioned, she mentioned that she still had the motel's guest registration cards from January 1947 and promised to hand them over to the police unit. A few days later, however, she revealed that she had actually burned them. New witnesses kept coming forward, recalling things they had seen at the motel during that period regarding Leslie Dillon. A maid also recalled that a man with a Scandinavian accent matching the description of Mark Hansen had checked into the room next to the one occupied by the young brunette. Other witnesses claimed to have seen a young woman resembling Elizabeth Short lying motionless on the bed, as if drugged. They had glimpsed her through a slightly ajar door. It was then that the gangster squad suffered a new and decisive blow, one that resulted in the mysterious, unsolved murder we know today. After reporting to their superiors that the Black Dahlia case was finally making headway, the detectives were told that their squad was being taken off the investigation and assigned new tasks. That was it. Here is the conclusion I reached after studying the case, first by reading the books, and then by examining the source materials upon which those books were based. The motive for the murder was revenge. A twofold revenge. I will explain this in detail right now. Mark Hansen, Jeff Connors, and Leslie Dillon were all implicated in the case. The Los Angeles Police Department, specifically its top brass, did everything in their power to ensure the killer was never found. And they succeeded. Now, here is how I envision the murder itself. There was no initial plan to kill her. After all, a motel on a busy street is hardly the ideal location for a murder. Leslie Dillon had known Elizabeth Short since at least December 1946. At Mark Hansen's behest, he rented a room for her at the Astor Motel. He then spiked her food with phenobarbital, a drug found in his possession in large quantities during a search. When Dr. Reader asked why he had so much of it, Dillon smirked and replied that he used it to slip into girls' ice cream, making them more compliant. Let's continue. Elizabeth Short falls into a state of severe drug-induced intoxication. Mark Hansen arrives and, most likely taking advantage of her helplessness, subjects her to a sexual assault before leaving the motel. This is entirely plausible, given that sex was precisely what he had been seeking from her throughout their acquaintance, albeit unsuccessfully. Next, Dillon enters the room. He, too, wants to rape her, and it is possible that he does so. She remains at the motel for several more days, kept in a state of intoxication through a steady supply of new doses. She has no control over herself. This conclusion is suggested by the maid's account of finding feces on the bed. Several witnesses see her in this state, naked and covered only by a sheet. At this point, the original plan agreed upon with Hansen, which did not involve killing Elizabeth Short, goes awry. Dillon flies into a rage, triggered by a factor that remains unknown. He strikes her repeatedly in the face, causing her death. He then brings 2 blankets and, after draining the body of blood, severs it at the waist. He also performs the various mutilations detailed in the autopsy report, including the Glasgow smile. He may have engaged in necrophilia with the body. Upon regaining his composure, Dylan realizes that instead of simply taking Short away from the location where she had been held for about 5 days and leaving her there, he has killed her. He meticulously washes the body parts first with water, then with gasoline in the shower, and drives them to a well-known vacant lot to dump them. Sometime later, he sends out Mark Hansen's personal belongings and address book, which he had found among Elizabeth Short's things. It was through this book that he linked Hansen to himself, forcing Hansen to pull every string he had so that Dylan and eventually the killer himself could escape punishment. He almost certainly stashed away the pages that had been cut out. One slashed body, more or less, what difference does it make? That was the remark Phineas Brown, the detective assigned to the Black Dahlia murder, once made when asked why the investigation was stalled. There is a famous photo of him at the crime scene. His older brother, Ted Brown, was a prominent police chief. Both men had close ties to Mark Hansen, involving both professional dealings in the corrections system and personal friendship. It was only when the gangster squad secretly took over the Short case bypassing Brown and Detective Harry Hansen that real progress toward solving it was made. You already know what happened next. Get Brown. That was the phrase Mark Hansen uttered in the ambulance after being shot by Lola Titus. This case will soon mark its 80th anniversary. Everyone involved in the affair has long since been laid to rest save for one elderly man who, back in that distant year of 1947, while delivering newspapers on his bicycle, rode past police cars and reporters and caught a fleeting glimpse of a naked, dismembered female corpse, imprinted in the vivid colors of a child's perception of that gruesome scene. And he has carried that terrifying fragment of his childhood with him to this very day.
Elizabeth Short achieved the popularity and fame she had dreamed of, but only after her death. It is hard to overstate the extent of that popularity. She is remembered. She is sympathized with. And most importantly, something she lacked during her lifetime, she is loved.
There must be a glow to open each door. There's a key.